I'm Jim Martin. I serve as Vice President of Harding School of Theology in Memphis, Tennessee. And I want to introduce you to today's speaker. Steve Cuss has written a fine little book, Managing Leadership Anxiety, which has been very helpful to so many of us. He is the founder of Capable Life, which is an online tool that I personally have found very helpful. And then he is lead pastor of Discovery Christian Church. So I want to welcome you here, Steve.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's always a delight to connect with you, and thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. And it's always good to be with you. As you well know, this past year has been a time of great anxiety for lots of ministers, church leaders, entire congregations. I wonder if you could just talk for a few moments about how this anxiety works and plays itself out in our lives and ministries.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I totally agree. I've been in ministry 25 years and 15 in a lead role. I think this is one of the hardest years I've ever had in
Wow.
leadership. So I totally agree. If for people who are feeling pretty thin or running on fumes, it's been a tough year. And I do think understanding anxiety really helps explain it and also give us some relief. So, Jim, obviously anxiety is a big word. It covers a lot of territory. The field that I work in is what's known as chronic anxiety.
Okay.
So, for example, there's trauma, there's grief. These are real forms of anxiety. But chronic anxiety is actually a clinical term. And I think it's the type of anxiety that a leader faces the most. And it's always based on a false need or a false belief. So, for example, if we talk about this last year, needing to know what to do, um, having to do something when you don't know what to do, those dynamics are going to make you anxious. And it doesn't matter if you're Yoda, if you're some kind of a Zen type person who can just roll with it. Not knowing what to do and having to do something will make you anxious. I think that's one of the reasons we've really struggled this last year. Also, I think in church leadership, particularly, there's this weird dynamic that because people attend a church, they think they know how to lead a church, and they get very comfortable telling us as leaders how to do our job. I know in my early time as a lead pastor, I was really surprised that out of my friend group inside my church, I was the only one that had my job evaluated on a regular basis. Like we all sat around and talked about the sermon. And I'm like, wait a minute, like you're an accountant. We don't talk about your bookkeeping. So there are some unique challenges for church leaders. And obviously I'm one, so my heart goes out. So what happens is there's all this stuff going on under the surface in us. And if we're not aware of it, it bubbles up like a volcano and it erupts. A lot of people think that anxiety is just worry and fear, but actually it's a response. It's a reaction to when you don't get what you think you need. So if you need to know what to do, if you need somebody to like you, if the sermon didn't go the way you thought it should, then whatever happens next, that's clinically known as chronic anxiety. So yeah, I think what can really help a leader is just to pay attention to anxiety in 4 spaces. So I'll just explain those. And then Jim, let's see where you want to go with it.
Okay.
But chronic anxiety shows up and infects 4 different spaces. First space is the space in me. Second one is the space between me and another person. Third space is the space inside the other person. Fourth space is the space between people. So obviously in me, we've already talked about it, the things that I think I need. A lot of ministry anxiety is generated because of relationships. And what's interesting is these can even be great relationships, but they still generate anxiety. It didn't go the way you want. Somebody had a critical word, something like that. Space number 3 is interesting. It's the space inside the other. If you've ever found yourself thinking, what were they thinking? Or why do they do it that way? That's third space. And then, of course, the fourth space between others. If you've ever walked into a room and there's already a mood in that room. So this is chronic anxiety. This is what I was trained in. And I really cut my teeth on this as a trauma chaplain because it's similar to ministry in local church. You have to walk into rooms so many times a day when you're a pastor and be attentive to all 4 of these spaces. And it's pretty exhausting. But if you're not attentive to it, it's worse. And so I find a lot of pastors are struggling because this is the first time in their life that they've really learned to pay attention to what's going on in them and the way it impacts their ability to be present with people. The way things coming at them is a challenge too. So that'd just be my real brief word to pastors is learn the four spaces and work hard on becoming attuned to what's going on. Because once you can then employ some tools to really get some relief.
I'm curious, Steve, of the four spaces, where do you begin?
Oh,
Which
okay. Yeah, thank you. Always begin with space number one, and you never graduate from space number one. The theory that I was trained in is family systems theory. By the way, many of you don't know me. I'm a theology nerd at heart, but I also was trained in family systems theory. And the big idea is that the more you work on yourself, the more you can calm a group. And in fact, let's take somebody who's like a usual suspect critic, they just keep coming at you. They are the problem. Like that's space number three. You're like, why do they do it? But actually, there's something that you are doing that is creating a pattern with that person. That if you can work on yourself, you can actually break the pattern. You can't change who they are, but you can change the way they relate to you. So I relate very differently to my usual suspect critics than I did when I first came. I spent way too much time trying to please them, trying to win them over with insight. So here would be an example of chronic anxiety, Jim, is I believe that if you just get to know me, you're going to like me. So if you don't like me, it's because you don't know me enough. And so what I do then is I give you more of my heart.
Yeah.
Now, the average healthy person, that works. I'm a decent human being. You're a decent human being. But those usual suspects that what they do is they weaponize that against me. And so my ability to work on myself and what I need and die to it, then that actually changes the other three spaces. So when I do my trainings, we spend 60 to 70% in space number one. And then we move through the spaces. We teach you how to notice anxiety in groups. But yeah, where you want to start is, can you name when you're anxious? That's how you begin. How do I know when I'm anxious? And if you don't know, ask a loved one, ask a spouse or a kid. If you have children, once your kids are about 8, they can tell you when you're anxious, even if you don't know. So that would definitely be where you start.
I've heard you say, Steve, that you still wrestle with anxiety.
Yeah.
Do you go back to number one as you realize, hey, I'm anxious right now? Is that what you do? Or
yeah, that's right. I battle anxiety every day. And again, chronic anxiety. I've never struggled with generalized anxiety or some of these more famous ones. And I got to just say, even though I've never struggled with it, I'm a big believer in the power of medicine and therapy. No, I'm talking leadership anxiety. I'm talking about when you get that email. I'm talking about the incessant need for every sermon to always be the best sermon. These pressures that we put ourselves under as pastors. I'm talking about, when you work for God, who is a delightful boss, you can forget that you're God's child and you operate as an employee more than a child. Just some of these fundamentals that I think pastors struggle with. So I struggle with those every day. And I wish I could say every day I work on space number one. The truth is I forget, just like you do.
Sure. Yes.
But for me, about 5 out of 10 times I remember. And then I typically train people who are newer on this. If you can get a 1 out of 10, that's an A. Because you've been living in the grip of chronic anxiety your whole life. Breaking the patterns can be really challenging. So I'm better at it when I'm really anxious because I have a low tolerance to stay in the grip of anxiety. That's really what I teach. I don't stop you from getting anxious. I stop you from staying anxious. And I got to say, that is a huge relief for people. So usually, like I got a text a few months ago, and the text was, "We need to meet." And the text followed up with, "I didn't want to talk to you Sunday because I knew it would spoil the sermon." I was like, oh man. So those are the texts that just, do pastors in. Well, that got me pretty anxious. So I was working my tools. And before my tools, I would have been spun up for the 3 weeks it took us to meet. And with my tools, it took me an hour. But I worked hard on those tools. So yeah.
Okay. Steve, thank you for these words. This alone is very helpful. And a lot of you, I suspect, would love to dive deeper with Steve on these very issues. There is going to be another video with Steve. It'll be on the Harbor website, and you can find it there. Steve, thank you for being here today.
Great. Thanks, Jim.